As the crowd threw stones, the lonely cowboy wrapped his coat around her, then she whispered his name. Welcome, dear listener, to another captivating tale from the untamed lands of the Old West. Before we ride into this emotional journey of courage and unexpected connection, take a moment to hit that subscribe button and join our growing community of story lovers. We'd love to know where in the world you're experiencing this story from, whether you're in the bustling streets of New York, the sunny shores of California, or somewhere across the globe. Drop a comment below telling us where you're listening from. Your support helps our channel grow, and we can't wait to share more stories with you. Now, settle in as we transport you to a small frontier town where fate brings two unlikely souls together in the most extraordinary circumstances. The sun hung low over Redemption Creek, a small settlement nestled between rolling hills and vast plains. Once a promising mining town, it now clung to existence through cattle trade and the occasional stagecoach passing through. The main street stretched like a dusty ribbon, lined with wooden buildings weathered by time and the harsh elements of the frontier. Thomas Blackwood dismounted his chestnut mare in front of the saloon, his boots landing heavily on the packed dirt. At 35, his face was weathered by years spent under the relentless sun, deep lines etched around eyes that had seen too much. The war had left him with more than just physical scars. It had hollowed him out, leaving behind a man who preferred the company of open skies to that of people. "Water her well," he instructed the stable boy, flipping him a coin. "She's carried me far today." The saloon offered the familiar sounds of clinking glasses and murmured conversations, a piano plinking out a melancholy tune in the corner. Thomas claimed a small table in the shadows, his back to the wall, an old habit from years of looking over his shoulder. He ordered whiskey, neat. "You're new," observed the barkeep, a stout man with graying sideburns. "Passing through." Thomas nodded curtly. "Got work at the Henderson Ranch. Heard they needed hands for the season. Old man Henderson runs a tight outfit. Good pay, though." The barkeep slid the glass across the worn wooden surface. "Town's been quiet lately. Too quiet, some might say." Thomas raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He hadn't come looking for conversation or trouble, just work and solitude. Yet something in the barkeep's tone suggested there was more to the story. "There's been talk," the man continued, leaning in slightly. "Strange happenings at the old Wilcox place, just past the creek. Some say a woman's living there alone. Ain't natural, especially not after what happened to her family." Thomas took a slow sip of his whiskey, the amber liquid burning a familiar path down his throat. "Not my concern," he replied, but his interest was piqued despite himself. The saloon doors swung open, bringing with them a gust of wind, and three men whose loud voices immediately dominated the room. They were ranch hands, judging by their attire. But there was something in their swagger that spoke of trouble. "Do another round for me and my boys." "Hank," the tallest one called out. His eyes swept the room and landed on Thomas. Well, fresh meat in town." Thomas kept his gaze on his drink, his right hand casually dropping to rest near the holster at his hip. "Not a threat, but a reminder. Leave him be, Curtis," the barkeep warned. "He's working for Henderson now." Curtis snorted. "Henderson's going soft, hiring drifters. This town's got enough problems without adding to them." Thomas finally looked up, his steel-grey eyes meeting Curtis's challenging stare. "I'm not looking for trouble," he said evenly. "Just a drink and a quiet evening." "Hear that, boys? He wants quiet." Curtis laughed, but something in Thomas's unwavering gaze made him think twice about pushing further. With a dismissive wave, he turned back to his companions. As the evening wore on, Thomas learned more about Redemption Creek through the fragments of conversations around him. The town had fallen on hard times after the silver mine dried up. Ranching was the lifeblood now, but drought had made the past 2 seasons difficult. And then there were the whispers about the Wilcox place, a family tragedy, a lone survivor, and the suspicion that followed her like a shadow. When Thomas finally stepped out into the cool night air, the town had settled into an uneasy quiet. The moon cast long shadows across the street as he made his way to the modest boarding house where he'd secured a room. Tomorrow he'd report to the Henderson Ranch and begin the work he'd come for, yet as he lay on the creaking bed, staring at the ceiling, it was the story of the mysterious woman at the Wilcox place that followed him into his dreams. Morning came with the distant crow of a rooster and the gentle pink of dawn bleeding into the sky. Thomas rose early, gathered his few possessions, and headed toward the Henderson Ranch. The trail took him along the creek, past rolling meadows dotted with wildflowers that defied the otherwise parched landscape. As he rounded a bend, the path split. One foot continued toward the Henderson property, while the other veered toward a small homestead nestled against a copse of trees. The Wilcox place, he presumed. Smoke curled from the chimney. Confirmation that someone indeed lived there. Thomas hesitated, curiosity tugging at him. Then he shook his head and urged his horse forward along the main trail. Whatever secrets the Wilcox place held, they weren't his to uncover. He had his own ghosts to outrun. The Henderson Ranch sprawled across several hundred acres of prime grazing land. A two-story farmhouse stood proudly at its center, surrounded by various outbuildings, corrals, and a large barn painted the traditional red. Cattle dotted the distant pastures, and the sound of hammering echoed from the direction of what appeared to be a half-constructed fence. Frank Henderson proved to be a fair but demanding employer, a stocky man in his 60s, with a full white beard and calloused hands that spoke of a lifetime of hard work. He sized Thomas up with sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. "Blackwood, is it? You've got the look of a man who's been on the trail a while." "Army?" Thomas nodded. "Cavalry. 7th Regiment." Henderson's expression softened slightly. "My oldest boy rode with the 5th. Didn't make it back from Gettysburg." He paused, the ghost of old grief passing across his weathered features. "Well, we need strong backs and steady hands here. Bunkhouse is yonder, tools in the shed, supper at 6 sharp. My wife doesn't tolerate tardiness." The work was exactly what Thomas needed, physically demanding enough to exhaust him, structured enough to keep his mind occupied. Days blended together as he repaired fences, moved cattle, and helped with 100 other tasks that kept the ranch running. The other hands were a rough but decent lot, and they gradually accepted Thomas into their midst, though he maintained his characteristic reserve. It was during his second week at the Henderson Ranch that Thomas first encountered her. He had ridden out to check on a section of fence reported damaged during the previous night's thunderstorm. The property bordered the Wilcox land, and as he worked, he felt the distinct sensation of being watched. Glancing up, he saw a woman standing at the edge of the trees, a rifle cradled in her arms. Not pointed at him, but ready. She wore a simple dress, her dark hair pulled back, and even from a distance, Thomas could see the wariness in her posture. "Henderson, land ends here," she called out, her voice clear despite the distance between them. "You're fixing the right side of the fence, I hope." Thomas straightened, wiping sweat from his brow. "Yes, ma'am, just making repairs after the storm." She studied him for a long moment. "You're new? One of Henderson's men?" "Thomas Blackwood. Started last week." She nodded slowly, as if filing away the information. "I'm Elizabeth Wilcox. This is my land you're looking at." The name confirmed what Thomas had suspected. This was the woman from the rumors, the one living alone at the old homestead, surrounded by whispers and suspicion. "Pleasure to meet you, Miss Wilcox. Don't worry, I know where the property line is." He returned to his work, driving a post into the ground with measured strikes of his mallet. She didn't leave immediately. Instead, she took a few steps closer, though still keeping a cautious distance. "No, you're not from around here." It wasn't a question, but Thomas answered anyway. "No, been moving around since the war." "The war took my brother," she said after a pause. "Pa couldn't bear it. Started drinking. then took sick last winter. Mama followed him to the grave not a month later. Thomas looked up, surprised at the personal revelation. Elizabeth Wilcox's face was solemn, her eyes holding a familiar kind of grief. He recognized it, the look of someone who had lost too much, too quickly. "I'm sorry for your losses," he said simply. "Don't need pity," she replied, lifting her chin slightly. "Just needed you to know I have every right to be here, despite what people in town might say." With that, she turned and walked back toward her homestead, the rifle still cradled in her arms. Thomas watched her go, puzzled by the encounter and the defensiveness in her tone. What exactly were people saying about Elizabeth Wilcox? He got his answer that evening. As the ranch hands gathered for supper in the bunkhouse, the conversation turned to Thomas's fence-mending assignment. "Saw you had company today," said Jim. "A lanky cowhand with a perpetual sunburn, the Wilcox woman giving you trouble." Thomas shrugged. "Just introduced herself. Seemed concerned about the property line." Several of the men exchanged glances. "Best keep your distance," advised Pete, the oldest among them. "That family's cursed or worse." "How do you mean?" Thomas asked, his curiosity getting the better of him. Pete leaned forward, lowering his voice though there was no need. Everyone was listening intently. "Started with the brother dying in the war. Then old man Wilcox lost his mind. Started raving about seeing his dead son around the property. Folks say the daughter, Elizabeth, she practiced witchcraft, drove her pa to drink and her ma to an early grave." Thomas frowned. "Sounds like a grieving family to me. Not uncommon after the war." "Maybe so," Pete conceded. "But there's more. Livestock going missing near her property. Strange lights at night. And anyone who crosses her seems to meet with bad luck." "Superstitious nonsense," Thomas muttered, though he noted how many of the men nodded along with Pete's tale. "Say what you will," Jim chimed in, "but Curtis Johnson's brother tried to court her last year. She turned him down flat, and a week later he was thrown from his horse, broke his neck. And then there was the matter of the Mason boy who went missing, last seen near the Wilcox Creek." Thomas set down his fork. "You're suggesting she had something to do with these accidents?" "Not suggesting anything," Pete said, raising his hands. "Just telling you what folks say. Town's been talking about running her off for months now. Only reason they haven't is old Henderson. He knew her pa from way back and won't hear a word against the family." Thomas glanced toward the main house, understanding now why Henderson had assigned him to that particular section of fence. The old rancher was keeping an eye on the Wilcox property, perhaps offering what protection he could to the woman living alone there. That night, Thomas lay awake longer than usual, thinking about Elizabeth Wilcox and the burden she carried, not just of loss and solitude, but of a community's fear and suspicion. He knew all too well how grief could hollow a person out, leaving them vulnerable to the judgments of those who didn't understand. And he knew, too, the dangerous power of rumors in small, isolated communities. Before sleep claimed him, Thomas made a decision. He would form his own opinions about Elizabeth Wilcox, based on his own observations, not on the whispered fears of superstitious townsfolk. The weeks that followed brought a scorching, dry spell that had everyone at the Henderson Ranch working twice as hard to keep the cattle watered and healthy. Thomas fell into the rhythm of ranch life, earning respect for his tireless work ethic and steady hand with the livestock. Yet his thoughts often drifted to the Wilcox homestead and its solitary occupant. He saw Elizabeth occasionally, usually at a distance, tending her small garden, mending fences on her own property, or riding out to check her modest herd of cattle. She acknowledged him with a nod when their paths crossed, but they hadn't spoken since that first encounter. Still, Thomas noticed things that contradicted the town's dark whispers. She maintained her property with obvious care. On Sundays, he spotted her riding toward town in her best dress, presumably for church services. And once, he observed her leaving supplies at the door of a struggling family who lived in a small shack at the edge of Henderson's property, slipping away before they could see who had left the gift. These didn't seem like the actions of a woman who practiced witchcraft or wished harm on her neighbors. But Thomas kept his observations to himself, aware that challenging the prevailing narrative too directly might only make things worse for Elizabeth. The situation changed on a sweltering Thursday when Thomas rode into town for supplies. As he secured his purchases to his saddle, he noticed a crowd gathering outside the general store. At its center stood Elizabeth, her face composed but pale, as Curtis Johnson and several other men blocked her path. "We've had enough of your dark doings, Miss Wilcox," Curtis was saying, his voice carrying across the street. "Drought's killing our cattle, and folks are saying it's unnatural, saying it started when you took to living alone out there, practicing who knows what." "That's absurd," Elizabeth replied, her voice steady despite the evident fear in her eyes. "The drought's affecting everyone, including me. I've lost 3 head this month alone." "Convenient excuse," sneered one of the other men. "Maybe you're sacrificing them in those rituals of yours." A murmur ran through the growing crowd. Thomas noticed that while some looked uncomfortable with the confrontation, no one stepped forward to defend Elizabeth. Even the sheriff, standing at the edge of the gathering, merely watched with a troubled expression. "I've done nothing wrong," Elizabeth insisted. "I'm just trying to keep my family's land, same as any of you would." "Your family's dead and gone," Curtis spat. "And this town would be better off if you joined them, or at least moved on." Thomas had heard enough. He stepped forward, positioning himself beside Elizabeth. "That's enough, Johnson. The lady's done nothing to deserve this treatment." Curtis's eyes narrowed. "Stay out of this, Blackwood. You're not even from around here. You don't know what she's capable of." "I know intimidating a woman alone in town isn't the mark of a decent man," Thomas countered, his voice low but carrying. He turned slightly toward Elizabeth. "Miss Wilcox, I believe Mr. Henderson was asking after some of your preserves. Perhaps I could escort you to the ranch after you've finished your shopping." Elizabeth looked at him, surprise and gratitude flickering across her features. "That would be most kind, Mr. Blackwood." Curtis stepped closer, his hand drifting toward the pistol at his hip. "This doesn't concern you, Drifter. It concerns anyone with a conscience," Thomas replied, not backing down. "Unless you're planning to draw on an unarmed woman in broad daylight, I suggest you step aside." For a tense moment, it seemed Curtis might escalate the situation further. Then the sheriff finally intervened, moving through the crowd with deliberate steps. "That's enough excitement for one day," he announced. "Curtis, you and your boys move along. Miss Wilcox, best finish your business and head home." Curtis glared but backed down, pointing a finger at Elizabeth. "This isn't over. Town meeting tonight. We'll be discussing what to do about you once and for all." As the crowd dispersed, Thomas remained at Elizabeth's side. "And are you all right?" She nodded, though her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her bonnet. "It's getting worse," she said quietly. "They've always whispered. But now—" She trailed off, glancing around at the townsfolk who still watched them with suspicious eyes. "Let me help you finish your errands," Thomas offered. "Then I'll see you safely home." Elizabeth studied him for a long moment. "Why are you doing this? You don't know me." "I know enough," he replied simply. "And I've seen what fear can do to people, how it can turn neighbors against each other over nothing but rumors and superstition." Something in his steady gaze seemed to reassure her. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood. I would appreciate the company on the ride home." They completed her shopping in tense silence, aware of the stares following them through town. As they mounted their horses and headed out, Thomas noticed dark clouds gathering on the horizon, the first promise of rain in weeks. "Looks like the drought might break tonight," he observed, hoping to ease the tension. Elizabeth followed his gaze to the distant thunderheads. "Yes, though it may bring trouble of its own. Flash floods are common in these parts when the rain comes after so long a dry spell." They rode in companionable silence for a while, the rhythmic hoofbeats a calming counterpoint to the growing tension in the air, both from the approaching storm and the morning's confrontation. "They're afraid," Elizabeth said suddenly. The drought, the poor harvests, the sickness that took 3 children last winter. They need someone to blame, and a woman living alone, keeping to herself. She shook her head. It's an old story. Thomas nodded. I've seen it before. During the war, when supplies ran short or disease swept through a camp, there was always talk of saboteurs or curses. Were you there long? The war, I mean. Her question was tentative, as if she knew she was treading on delicate ground. 4 years, Thomas replied after a pause. Saw things I wish I hadn't. Did things I can't undo. Elizabeth's expression softened with understanding. My brother wrote home once about the toll it was taking. He said the hardest part wasn't the fighting or the dying. It was watching good men become something else, something they wouldn't recognize in the mirror. The insight struck uncomfortably close to Thomas's own experience. Your brother sounds like he was a wise man. He was, she said softly. The best of us. They had reached the fork in the road where their paths would diverge, one leading to the Henderson Ranch, the other to the Wilcox homestead. Thomas hesitated. I should see you all the way home, he said, glancing at the darkening sky. Storms coming in fast. Elizabeth shook her head. I've weathered storms alone before, Mr. Blackwood, and you're expected back at the ranch. Thomas, he corrected gently. Dee and Henderson will understand. She considered him for a moment, then nodded. All right. Thomas, I wouldn't mind the company, if you're certain. They turned their horses toward the Wilcox property as the first distant rumble of thunder rolled across the plains. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of rain and electricity. By the time they reached the homestead, the sky had darkened to an ominous purple-grey, and lightning flashed along the horizon. Elizabeth's home was modest but well-maintained. A sturdy cabin with a small porch, a barn that had seen better days but still stood strong, and several corrals housing her small herd of cattle. A vegetable garden, wilting from the drought but still yielding produce, stretched along one side of the house. You've done well, keeping all this going on your own, Thomas observed as they stabled their horses. Had no choice, Elizabeth replied, though there was pride in her voice. This land is all I have left of my family. I won't let it go without a fight. Inside, the cabin was neat and cozy, with simple furnishings and touches that spoke of a woman determined to maintain civilization in the wilderness. Curtains at the windows, a bookshelf filled with well-worn volumes, a quilt draped over the back of a rocking chair. Elizabeth busied herself lighting lamps as the storm darkened the sky further. You're welcome to wait out the worst of it here, she offered. I can make coffee. Thomas nodded, grateful for the chance to rest before riding back to the ranch in the rain. But as Elizabeth moved toward the stove, a sound from outside caught their attention. Hoofbeats, multiple riders approaching fast. They exchanged a glance, both immediately understanding the significance. Thomas moved to the window, carefully peering out without being seen. What he saw made his blood run cold. Curtis Johnson and at least a dozen men from town were riding up to the homestead, torches in hand despite the coming rain. Their faces, illuminated by the flickering flames, were set with grim purpose. They've come for me, Elizabeth whispered, her voice remarkably steady given the circumstances. And the town meeting must have ended with a decision. Thomas's mind raced. Is there somewhere you can hide? A cellar, perhaps? She shook her head. I won't hide in my own home. This is my land, my property. They have no right. Elizabeth, Thomas said urgently, those men aren't here to talk. They've worked themselves into a frenzy. It's not safe. Before she could respond, Curtis's voice boomed from outside. Elizabeth Wilcox, come out and face what's coming to you. Thomas moved to the door, positioning himself between Elizabeth and the gathering mob. Stay back, he instructed her. Let me try to reason with them first. They won't listen to reason, she replied, but she remained inside as Thomas stepped onto the porch. The scene before him was like something from a nightmare. Curtis and his men had formed a semicircle in front of the cabin, their torches casting wild shadows in the growing gloom. Behind them, the storm clouds roiled, and lightning split the sky. "This doesn't concern you, Blackwood," Curtis called out. "Step aside. Our quarrel is with the witch." "There is no witch," Thomas replied firmly. "Just a woman trying to survive on her family's land. Whatever you think she's done, you're mistaken." A murmur ran through the crowd. Thomas recognized several faces from town, including some he would have thought too level-headed for such madness. Fear and superstition were powerful forces indeed. "She's bewitched you too, has she?" Curtis sneered. "The drought, the sickness in town, the strange happenings, all started when she took to living here alone. We aim to run her off, or worse. You aim to murder an innocent woman based on nothing but fear and old wives' tales," Thomas countered, his hand instinctively moving toward his holster. "I can't let that happen." Curtis's expression darkened. "One man against all of us. You'll die alongside her." "Maybe," Thomas acknowledged, standing his ground. "But some of you will join me before it's over." The tension stretched taut as a bowstring. Then, as if in response to the human drama unfolding below, the heavens opened. Rain began to fall, tentatively at first, then in sheets, dousing torches and soaking the gathered mob in seconds. Thunder crashed directly overhead, and several horses reared in panic. Into this chaos stepped Elizabeth, moving to stand beside Thomas on the porch. "You've come to drive me from my home," she called out, her voice somehow carrying over the storm, "and to blame me for acts of nature and the cruelties of fate. But look around you." She gestured to the pouring rain, to the lightning illuminating the sky. "The drought breaks tonight, not because of anything I've done, but because this is the way of things. Seasons change. Rain follows drought. Life follows death. And none of it has anything to do with your fears or my grief." For a moment, her words seemed to penetrate the collective madness. Some of the men shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware of the absurdity of their position, standing in a downpour, threatening a lone woman over imagined crimes. But Curtis was not so easily swayed. "Pretty words won't save you," he growled, drawing his pistol. "We've made our decision." Thomas drew his own weapon in response. "And I've made mine." What happened next occurred with such speed that later Thomas would struggle to recall the exact sequence. Curtis fired, the shot going wide. Thomas returned fire, grazing Curtis's arm. The mob surged forward as Elizabeth screamed a warning, and then, cutting through the chaos like a blade, the unmistakable sound of a rifle being cocked. Every head turned toward the sound. There, at the edge of the property, sat Frank Henderson on his massive black stallion, rifle aimed squarely at Curtis. Behind him were at least 20 of his ranch hands, all similarly armed. "That's quite enough," Henderson called out, his voice carrying despite the storm. "You boys turn around and head back to town, or the next man who raises a weapon gets a bullet for his trouble." Curtis, clutching his bleeding arm, glared defiantly. "This isn't your fight, Henderson. You're on land that borders mine, threatening a neighbor I've sworn to protect," Henderson replied evenly. "That makes it very much my fight." The standoff held for several tense heartbeats. Then, slowly, Curtis lowered his weapon. "This isn't over," he muttered, but the threat rang hollow as his supporters began to disperse, melting away into the rain and darkness. As the mob retreated, Thomas felt a wave of relief wash over him. He turned to Elizabeth, who stood pale but composed beside him. "Are you all right?" She nodded, though she was trembling slightly. Thanks to you and Mr. Henderson." Her eyes met his, filled with a complex mixture of gratitude and something deeper that Thomas couldn't quite name. "Thank you for standing with me when no one else would." Henderson approached, dismounting with the ease of a man half his age. "Miss Wilcox, I made a promise to your father years ago that I'd look out for his family if anything happened to him. I aim to keep that promise." He glanced at Thomas. "Seems Blackwood here has the same idea." "Sir," Thomas acknowledged, holstering his weapon. "I appreciate the timely arrival." Henderson nodded grimly. One of my boys overheard the planning in town, rode straight back to alert me. He turned to Elizabeth. Miss Wilcox, I don't think it's safe for you to stay here alone tonight. The rain might cool their tempers, but there's no telling what tomorrow might bring. Where would you have me go? She asked. This is my home. My wife would be pleased to have your company at the ranch house for a few days, Henderson offered, just until things settle. Elizabeth looked torn, glancing back at the cabin that contained all she had left of her family. I can't just leave. I'll stay, Thomas said suddenly. Keep an eye on things here while you're gone. Make sure nothing happens to your property. Both Elizabeth and Henderson looked at him in surprise. That's beyond the call of duty, Blackwood, Henderson said. It's the right thing to do, Thomas replied simply. Miss Wilcox deserves to know her home is safe while she's away. Elizabeth's eyes shone with unshed tears. You would do that for me? A stranger? Thomas met her gaze steadily. You're not a stranger anymore. In that moment, as rain poured down around them and the storm raged overhead, something shifted between them. A connection formed in crisis, a bond of trust where before there had been only cautious acknowledgement. Then I accept, Elizabeth said softly. Both offers. Thank you. As Henderson's men prepared to escort Elizabeth to the safety of the ranch, she paused before mounting her horse. Reaching out, she briefly touched Thomas's hand. Be careful, she murmured, and thank you again for everything. Thomas watched as she rode away with Henderson and most of his men, leaving him with 2 trusted ranch hands who would help secure the property. The rain continued to fall, a cleansing deluge that would bring life back to the parched land. But as Thomas turned to face the empty cabin, he knew that the storm, both literal and figurative, was far from over.